The piece of paper in Eleanor Washington's weathered hands had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had become permanent lines, like wrinkles on a face that had seen 8 decades of joy and sorrow. What started as a game show question about making grandparents proud became the moment when a dying teacher delivered her final lesson, when a lost teenager found his purpose, and when Steve Harvey discovered that sometimes the most important education happens not in classrooms, but in the space between questions and answers. 89-year-old Eleanor Washington sat in the front row of the Family Feud audience, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the studio that her grandson Tyler had been reluctant to bring her to. The early stages of Alzheimer's had begun stealing pieces of her memory, but on her good days, like today, she was still the formidable retired educator who had shaped 3 generations of students in the Atlanta public school system. What the audience couldn't see was the carefully written list tucked in her purse, 50 years of teaching wisdom distilled into the most important lessons she needed Tyler to understand before her mind could no longer hold them. Tyler Washington, 19 years old, and carrying the weight of disappointing everyone who had ever believed in him, shifted uncomfortably in his seat beside his grandmother. He dropped out of Morehouse College after his first semester, moved back home with no plan and less motivation, and spent the last 6 months watching his brilliant grandmother slowly lose the sharp intellect that had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8. A Family Feud appearance had been Nana's idea, her way of creating one last memory together, before the disease took away her ability to be the grandmother he'd always known. The Washington family, Nana, Tyler, and Tyler's aunt Patricia, who had helped raise him, were facing off against the Roberts family from Birmingham in what should have been a straightforward Thursday afternoon taping. But Eleanor Washington had come to the studio with an agenda that had nothing to do with winning prize money and everything to do with saving her grandson's future. For 50 years, Eleanor had taught high school English, watching thousands of students walk through her classroom doors carrying dreams, fears, potential, and pain. She'd developed an intuitive ability to recognize the moment when a young person stood at a crossroads, when the next decision would determine whether they moved toward their potential or away from it. Tyler was at such a crossroads, and Eleanor was running out of time to guide him through it. The list in her purse wasn't random. Every item had been carefully chosen, based on decades of watching students succeed and fail, of understanding what young people needed to hear when the world felt too big and their place in it too small. Life lessons bingo, she'd written at the top, followed by 25 pieces of wisdom that had proven themselves true over half a century of teaching teenagers how to become adults. The game had been progressing normally with Steve Harvey working his trademark magic on both families. Eleanor had surprised everyone by answering 2 questions with responses that weren't on the board, but were so insightful that Steve had awarded points anyway. When asked to name something that gets better with age, instead of saying wine or cheese, Eleanor had answered understanding, earning applause and a knowing nod from Steve, who hurried wisdom when he heard it. Tyler, meanwhile, had barely participated. When his turn came, he gave safe, obvious answers that showed he was present in body but absent in spirit. Steve, with his decades of experience reading people, noticed the disconnect between the sharp, engaged grandmother and the withdrawn young man who seemed to be going through the motions of living rather than actually engaging with life. Everything changed during the 4th round, when Steve announced a category that would transform the show: things that make grandparents proud. Patricia Washington had just given a solid answer: graduation, that earned 28 points and put the family in the lead. The strategy was working, the audience was engaged, and the Washington family seemed headed for a comfortable victory. But when Steve called Tyler to the podium for his turn, something in the young man's posture telegraphed that this question had hit differently than the others. Tyler approached the podium with the slow, reluctant walk of someone who didn't want to be seen, didn't want attention, didn't want to disappoint anyone else but couldn't figure out how to avoid it. He stood at the microphone, looking at the board as if the answers might materialize without him having to think of them. "Tyler," Steve said gently, recognizing the hesitation. "Things that make grandparents proud. What you got for me, young man?" Tyler looked at the board, then at his family, then at Steve. The silence stretched longer than usual. past the point where it was comfortable, into the territory where everyone in the studio began to sense that something was wrong. "I don't know," Tyler said finally, his voice barely audible over the studio's sound system. "I haven't done anything to make anyone proud yet." The words hung in the air like a confession, raw and painful in their honesty. Steve's expression changed immediately, his entertainer's mask dropping to reveal the man underneath who understood that this wasn't about a game anymore. "What do you mean, Tyler?" Steve asked, stepping closer to the podium. "You haven't done anything to be proud of." Tyler shrugged, the gesture of a young man who had convinced himself that his potential was evidence of his failure rather than proof of his possibilities. "I dropped out of college. I don't have a job. I live with my grandmother who's sick, and I can't even take care of her properly. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing with my life, and I'm running out of time to figure it out." The studio had fallen completely silent. This wasn't typical Family Feud material, but Steve Harvey had learned long ago that the most important moments often happened when people stopped performing and started being honest. "Tyler," Steve said, "look at me. How old are you?" 19. 19, Steve repeated. "And you think you're running out of time to figure out your life?" Before Tyler could answer, a voice from the audience cut through the conversation with the authority of someone who had spent decades teaching young people not to underestimate themselves. "Tyler Washington," Eleanor said, standing up from her seat in the front row with the slow dignity of a woman who had commanded classrooms for half a century. "You stop that foolishness right now." Steve turned toward Eleanor, immediately recognizing that whatever was about to happen was more important than any game show format. The cameras followed his lead, focusing on the elderly woman who had become the most compelling presence in the studio. "Ma'am," Steve said, approaching Eleanor's section, "sounds like you got something to say to your grandson." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out the folded piece of paper, holding it up so Tyler could see it from the podium. "Steve Harvey," she said, her voice carrying the clear authority that had made her a legendary teacher. "I've been waiting 50 years to have an audience this big for one of my lessons. Can I teach these people something?" Steve looked at Eleanor, then at Tyler, then at the production team in the booth, who were frantically trying to figure out whether to encourage this deviation from the show's format. But Steve Harvey had spent enough time in front of audiences to recognize a moment that mattered more than television ratings. "Mrs. Washington," Steve said, "this is your classroom now. What do you want to teach us?" Eleanor unfolded her list with the careful ceremony of someone unveiling something precious. "This," she said, holding up the paper, "is 50 years of watching young people like Tyler convince themselves that they're failures when they're just getting started. Tyler thinks he hasn't done anything to make me proud because he's looking at the wrong list." She looked directly at her grandson, who was still standing at the podium but had turned his full attention to his grandmother. "Tyler, you asked what makes grandparents proud. Let me tell you what's really on that list." Steve held up his hand to quiet the audience, understanding that whatever was about to happen needed to be heard. "Go ahead, Mrs. Washington. Tell us what's on your list." Eleanor adjusted her glasses and began reading from her carefully written notes. "Number 1. Having the courage to admit when you're lost." Tyler did that. "Number 2. Caring more about taking care of someone you love than about what other people think of your choices." Tyler does that every day. Tyler's eyes began to fill with tears as he realized that his grandmother had been watching him differently than he'd been watching himself. "Number 3. Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger, "being willing to start over when your first plan doesn't work." Tyler did that when he left college, even though people made him feel like a failure for it. Number 4. Understanding that your life is about more than your achievements. Tyler knows that, even if he's forgotten it lately. Steve had moved closer to Eleanor, drawn by the power of her words and the love behind them. "Mrs. Washington, how many items are on that list?" 25, Eleanor said. "One for every year I want Tyler to remember these lessons, assuming I won't be here to remind him myself." The studio audience gasped audibly at the implication. Steve's expression changed as he understood that this wasn't just a grandmother giving advice. This was a teacher delivering her final curriculum. "Tyler," Eleanor called to her grandson, "come over here." This lesson isn't meant to be shouted across a room. Tyler left the podium and walked to his grandmother's section, his composure cracking as he realized that this moment was about much more than a game show appearance. When he reached Eleanor's row, she took his hands in hers. "Sit down, baby," she said gently, and Tyler sat on the floor in front of her chair, putting himself at her eye level the way he had when he was 8 years old and needed comfort after his parents died. Steve, recognizing the sacred nature of what was happening, called to the production booth. "Stop the clock," he announced. "We're not playing a game anymore. We're witnessing something more important." Eleanor looked at Tyler with the expression of a woman who was trying to pour a lifetime of love and wisdom into whatever time they had left together. "Tyler, I need you to understand something. This list isn't about what you need to do to make me proud. This list is about recognizing that you already have everything you need to build a life that matters." She handed him the paper. "Read number 5. Tyler took the list with trembling hands and read aloud, "Asking for help when you need it, instead of suffering in silence." "When's the last time you did that?" Eleanor asked. Tyler thought for a moment. "When I asked you to come to this show with me because I didn't want to do it alone." "That's right." Number 6. Choosing love over fear, even when love is harder. Tyler looked up at his grandmother, beginning to understand. "When I moved back home to take care of you instead of staying at school." "Exactly. Keep reading." For the next 20 minutes, Tyler worked through Eleanor's list with his grandmother, with Steve Harvey facilitating and the entire studio serving as witnesses to the most important lesson any of them had ever observed. Each item on the list reflected something Tyler had already done or demonstrated, reframing his perceived failures as evidence of his character and potential. Number 15. Understanding that your education doesn't end when you leave school. It begins when you start paying attention to life. Number 18. Recognizing that taking care of people is just as important as achieving things. Number 22. Having the wisdom to know that your timeline doesn't have to match anyone else's timeline. By the time they reached the final items on the list, Tyler was crying openly, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of seeing himself through his grandmother's eyes, instead of through the lens of his own disappointment. Number 25, Eleanor said, her voice soft but clear. Understanding that making someone proud isn't about being perfect, it's about being brave enough to keep trying, keep growing, and keep loving people even when life gets complicated. Tyler looked up at his grandmother, then at Steve, then at the audience that had been transformed from game show spectators into witnesses of profound love. "Nana," Tyler said, "I get it now. But what am I supposed to do with this? How do I turn this into a life?" Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher who had successfully delivered the most important lesson of her career. "Tyler, you're going to finish college. Not because you have to, but because you want to learn how to help other young people the way I've helped you. You're going to become a teacher, like me, but better than me because you'll understand what it feels like to be lost and found again." Steve, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, stepped forward. "Tyler, your grandmother just gave you more than a life lesson. She gave you a calling, but I want to add something to her list." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out one of his personal business cards. "Mrs. Washington, with your permission, I'd like to make sure Tyler has the support he needs to follow through on this plan." Eleanor nodded, understanding that Steve's offer represented the kind of mentorship that could change Tyler's trajectory. "Tyler," Steve said, "I'm going to connect you with people who can help you get back into school, help you find your path in education, and help you turn your grandmother's wisdom into your life's work. But more than that, I want you to understand something that your grandmother just taught all of us." He looked at Tyler, then at Eleanor, then at the camera that would carry this message to millions of viewers. "Education isn't about information," Steve said. "It's about transformation. Your grandmother just demonstrated the highest form of teaching. She took everything she knew about life and used it to change the way someone she loves sees himself. That's not just good teaching, that's love in action." The studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual game show celebration. It was the sound of people recognizing that they had witnessed something sacred, something that transcended entertainment and touched the realm of genuine human connection. After the cameras stopped rolling, Tyler and Eleanor spent another hour in the studio, with Steve facilitating conversations between Tyler and education professionals who happened to be in the audience. By the end of the day, Tyler had 3 scholarship offers, 5 mentorship opportunities, and a clear path back to the education that would allow him to carry forward his grandmother's legacy. 6 months later, Tyler Washington enrolled in Georgia State University's education program, specializing in counseling and student support. He kept Eleanor's list framed in his dorm room and later in his classroom, referring to it whenever he encountered a student who had convinced themselves that they were running out of time to figure out their life. Eleanor Washington passed away 18 months after the Family Feud appearance, but not before seeing Tyler graduate with honors and accept his first teaching position at the same high school where she had spent her career. At her funeral, Tyler read all 25 items from her list, explaining how each one had continued to guide him and the students he now served. Steve Harvey established the Eleanor Washington Teaching Excellence Foundation, providing scholarships and support for education students who demonstrated the kind of wisdom and heart that Eleanor had embodied. The foundation's motto, taken from item number 25 on Eleanor's list, reads, "Making someone proud isn't about being perfect. It's about being brave enough to keep trying, keep growing, and keep loving people even when life gets complicated." The episode became one of the most shared Family Feud clips in the show's history, not because of the game itself, but because of the lesson that happened when the game stopped and real life began. Education schools across the country began using Eleanor's 25-item list as a framework for understanding student development and the relationship between academic achievement and personal growth. Tyler Washington, now in his 3rd year of teaching, keeps a photo from that Family Feud taping on his desk, not the group shot with Steve Harvey, but a candid moment captured when he was sitting at his grandmother's feet, reading her list and seeing himself clearly for the first time. Next to the photo is a small sign that reads Mrs. Washington's classroom, where every student gets to rewrite their story. The lesson Eleanor Washington taught that day in the Family Feud studio wasn't just for Tyler. It was for every young person who has ever confused temporary setbacks with permanent failure, every educator who has ever wondered whether their work really matters, and every family member who has ever loved someone enough to help them see their own potential when they've lost sight of it themselves. Number 26. Tyler often tells his students, adding to his grandmother's original list, understanding that the best teachers are the ones who help you discover what you already know about yourself. Because that's what Eleanor Washington did in the most public classroom she ever commanded, proving that the most important education happens not when we learn new information, but when we finally understand the truth about our own worth, potential, and capacity for growth.